If your kids are already out of high school, you probably remember how confusing college planning was. Where do we even start? Fast Start to College is the guide I wish we'd had. Clear timelines, smart college lists, and real talk about money. If you know a family going through it now, send them our way. Visit www.faststarttocollege.com. Proud sponsor of the Real Without Religion podcast.
Welcome to Voices from the Past, a series where we bring forward the teachers and thinkers who reimagined faith long before we knew we could. These voices saw the Bible as symbolic and alive, taught that thought creates reality, and reminded us that the divine lives within. This isn't boring history class. These are the spiritual ancestors we were never told about, writers, mystics, and metaphysical trailblazers who saw things differently and dared to say it out loud. So sit back as James introduces us to some long-lost friends, voices that still speak, wisdom that still resonates, and a lineage that just might feel like home.
Hey everyone, this is the Real Without Religion podcast. Now don't let that intro fool you. This is still our podcast, but we're going to be doing something different over the next few weeks. I want to take the time to introduce you to notable characters that are in your spiritual heritage that you may not even have ever heard or known about. And today we're going to start with Neville Goddard. Now, let me just say this for all of our podcasts coming up. Don't think of this as like a history lesson, and don't be tempted to not listen to these episodes because they're going to be really, really good. Let's think of it more, instead of a documentary on TV, as us sitting down together and going through an old picture album of people that we didn't even know existed. Let's make it fascinating, because I believe that you'll see that it is. Now, Neville isn't a household name, but his teachings have quietly shaped a lot of the spiritual ideas that you see today. Things like the law of assumption, visualization, your inner state, that's all Neville. So in this episode, I want to introduce you to some of his core ideas and share how they've shown up in my own life, and even imagine what it might sound like if Neville walked into 2025 and explained it all in plain language. So let's jump in. Now, Neville started teaching in the 1930s and 40s, when most of the religious world was still deeply rooted in external authority. You know, the church told you who God was, what to believe, and how to behave. And spiritual power was out there, up there, but definitely not inside of you. And here comes old Neville. Here's what he started saying. Your imagination is God. You are the operant power. Assume the feeling and you create the results. So I'm sure you can guess what would happen. Most religious leaders said, this guy is a heretic. Neville didn't attack the church, but he bypassed it entirely. And he taught that you're already connected to the divine, whether anyone gives you permission or not. People called his teachings mysticism, but it was more about conscious creation. And he was doing it in New York City, in packed lecture halls with people hanging on to every word. Not because he was selling hype, but because he was offering freedom. Now, Neville wasn't some positivity guru or a prosperity coach. He was what was considered a mystic, a thinker, a storyteller. And he believed that your imagination isn't just a place to escape. It's the place where creation actually begins. He said things like, change your conception of yourself, and you will automatically change the world in which you live. Now, at first, that sounds poetic, but he literally meant it. The version of yourself that you believe in, the one that you live from, that's the one that shapes your life. And for me, when I started reading about Neville and reading his work, I sensed it was like a wake-up call because I realized how often I was imagining like worst-case scenarios or picturing myself not getting what I wanted and then calling it, well, I'm just being realistic. Neville would say, no, that's just unintentional imagination. So let's hear how I imagine Neville might explain it if he were standing here today talking to a room of curious people in 2025.
Let's keep this simple. You're always imagining, every day. Most of the time, you don't even realize it. You imagine being rejected, or getting sick, or losing out. And then you say, well, that's just being realistic. But your imagination isn't passive. It's creative. It's planting seeds right into your subconscious. And your subconscious, it doesn't judge. It doesn't say, well, that's not true. It just takes the picture you give it and starts shaping your reality to match. So here's what I teach. If you want something to change, don't start with your actions. Start with your state. Ask yourself, if this desire was already fulfilled, how would I feel? How would I think? How would I move through the world? That's what I mean by living in the end. You don't have to fake it. You just have to get familiar with the version of you who's already there. And then, here's the part that takes trust. You stay there. You persist in that feeling, even when nothing outside has changed yet. Because change begins within. You are the operant power. It's not out there. It's you.
Thank you, Neville. Now, Neville wasn't really a ball of fire. He was more of a deep thinker. But people hung on his every word. That was his actual voice. But he tells the story of Abdullah. It's one of his most famous stories. And Abdullah was his teacher. And he was a perfect example of what living in the end actually looked like. So in 1933, Neville wanted to go home to Barbados to see his family. But he didn't have the money, and he told Abdullah about it. And Abdullah didn't say, well, let's sit and figure this out. He said, you're already in Barbados. Neville was like, what? I'm standing here in New York. But Abdullah said, no, you went to Barbados, and you're there now. Go to sleep every night in Barbados. Feel the air. Walk the streets. It's done. And then he slammed the door in Neville's face. And Neville tried to bring it up again a few days later, and Abdullah wouldn't even discuss it. The decision had already been made in consciousness. So, a few weeks later, Neville's brother sent him a ticket, first class to Barbados. That's the whole teaching in one story. Decide, assume, persist, and then receive. And, of course, Neville went to Barbados. And by the way, he didn't call his brother back then and tell him, oh, this is what I'm looking for. The universe provided it for him. So what do we do with all this? Well, I think the real lesson is that we don't have to fake it or pretend. But we can start practicing by living in the state of what we want to be. And what does that mean? That means you are not saying someday I'll do this, but right now, the person that you want to be, start thinking that way, acting that way, and living that way. Neville would say, you do not attract what you want, you attract what you are. And that's not a guilt trip. That's an invitation. We can change the channel we're listening to. So this week, pick one area of your life, just one, And instead of worrying about it or trying to fix it, take a few minutes and imagine what it would feel like if it already worked out. And again, feeling is the key. You don't have to know how, you just have to live from the end. Neville would remind you, by assuming that feeling, you call it into being. Your faith is your fortune. You are the operate power. And I'll just add this to what Neville said. Folks, thank you for listening. Stay grounded, stay curious, and stay real. Amen. Stay.
Thanks for joining us on Real Without Religion. If this stirred something deep within you, hit subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's ready to wake up. You don't have to go back to the box. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be willing to be real and trust what's already inside you. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay real.
When my kid was applying to college, we had Google and Panic and a half-eaten SAT study guide under the couch. Fast start to college is what we needed. Real help, actual answers, and none of the all-nighters. So if you know a family heading into this mess, save them the meltdown. Send them to www.faststarttocollege.com. Proud sponsor of the Real Without Religion podcast, because stress isn't spiritual.